All right, g'day guys, and welcome to this episode of Aussie English. I have Lamont from Days of French and Swedish. It is, I guess it would be first and foremost a YouTube channel, right, mate?
It is, yeah, definitely.
So welcome to the podcast. How you going?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm good, thanks. I'm well. Yeah.
So I stumbled across your YouTube channel recently, as YouTube likes to show you quite a few different things to get you hooked on different channels and everything. And I went
Yeah.
down the rabbit hole. I can't remember which video it must have been that I saw first. But I'm trying to remember. No, I've watched so many now, but I went down the rabbit hole and started binge watching them, and it seems like you and I have a lot in common, which
Yeah.
is pretty much why I was like, man, you've got to come on the podcast. So,
Yeah.
can you tell us a bit about yourself and where you're from?
So I'm from a little city south of Sydney called Wollongong, which is pretty well known to people on the east coast of New South Wales, a little bit known in general Australia, and not at all known outside of that generally.
What's your slang term for Wollongong? Because we would hear it, I think, as the gong, but do you guys actually use that?
I mean, not me personally, but it's probably more often referred to as the gong outside of the gong, even by
Yeah.
people who live there. It's like, yeah, I'm going back to the gong, but you wouldn't say like, I'll meet you in the gong kind of thing. You wouldn't
And
like,
you can't use woolies either, right? That's taken.
no,
I
yeah,
see in woolies, so you get confused.
nah. Yeah, it's got to be the gong. You can't even say gong. It's got to be the gong. So it's not really any shorter to say. Um, um, but yeah, like, so I was born here. I lived here till I was 10, and then I moved to Sydney. And then when I finished school, I moved to Newcastle and lived there for 11 years.
Which
And
is further
then,
north again, about the same
yeah,
distance as
yeah,
Wollongong is south.
a little bit further north,
Okay.
because you've got the central coast between Sydney and Newcastle, whereas you don't have that between Sydney and Wollongong. So Newcastle's like a proper kind of trek. Wollongong is almost like far south Sydney.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I lived there for about 12 years, and then we moved back here. And when I'm in Wollongong, I say I'm from Newcastle. And when well, I have been it's been almost 6 years now, so I should probably stop saying that. But yeah, so that's pretty much in terms of my geography.
Mm-hmm. So did you grow up listening to Silverchair quite a lot?
Yes, actually, but not. You know they're from Newcastle, right?
Yeah, that's why I asked.
Oh, right. But
is it because of that?
No, but like that was in my 20s that I lived in Newcastle.
Okay, gotcha.
But no, I kind of lived on Silverchair through high school, actually. It didn't
Exactly.
really ever occur to me that I was moving to like Silverchair City when I moved to Newcastle. But even though I was studying music there, somewhat
No kidding.
ironically, yeah.
What were you studying?
Like classic. So I was at the Conservatorium of Newcastle, and so I majored in composition. And
So is that what people that are not really that amazing at any individual instrument end up doing? Or is that you're like, I'm good at all instruments, so I just want to do this?
that is absolutely the case with me, that I wasn't amazing at any instrument, but I don't want to speak on behalf of my fellow composition students who were actually pretty good at instrument. I was definitely the worst at instruments, probably in my year, but at the same time, one of the best at like all the kind of theory stuff, and particularly what we call oral skills, so like listening and telling you what note is what and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, no shame in well, not no shame. I have no difficulty admitting that I was definitely one of the worst at instruments, if not the worst. But yeah, and so languages, like I studied German, quite similar to yourself. Again, I studied German. I know you didn't study German, but a language through high school, and was just the worst student in the world. Not because of like, what do you call it? Like
Not aptitude, but just the way in which it was taught.
Just doing the work, like not even the way in which it was taught. A lot of people like to rag on the way schools teach language. And at least my teacher was actually really good and was really, she did it in a fun way, and she was encouraging and everything. And she was immensely patient with me and two other guys who just never did any of the work we were supposed to do. And it got to in year 12. It got to the point that in year 12, she actually kind of gave up on me in particular, because she was like, you're just not doing anything. Like, there's no point in you being here. You're like making it hard for everyone else. And by that point, even my mates had started to take it somewhat seriously. And yeah, so I was the best at German I ever got was when we went to Germany in year 11, and I was not forced to speak it, but I decided to try and speak it with the family that I was staying there with. And it's kind of unbelievable how you can get to a stage of thinking in a language even when you have very little of that language. Like, because I remember actually thinking in German, despite the fact that I've never really been anywhere close to fluent in German. But yeah, and then nothing through, like when I finished school, I didn't pick up German ever again, and just nothing through till I was actually 30. And I have so many stories for how I started learning Swedish that are all kind of partly true, that I'm not really sure which like combination of them is the truth anymore. I just remember that one day I started it sort of not really expecting it to go anywhere, and then one day later being like, this is all I do now. I don't really remember what happened in between.
So Swedish chose you.
Sort of, except that I'm not even sure. Like, it honestly could have been any language. I think Swedish was pretty well suited to the approach that I was taking, which was like, I'm just going to learn as much as I can of this. And Swedish is very easy at those beginning stages, because there's no conjugation of verbs. So it doesn't matter who's doing a verb, everyone does it in the same way.
It's almost like English, except we've got the third person, right?
Yeah, we've got the third person one.
Singular,
but, yeah. But so in Swedish it doesn't, and that just makes a lot of things quite a lot simpler. So if you then have like what you might call complicating factors within a sentence, so you say like, they, knowing that they will go there later, decide to do this. You'll even hear Swedes and Norwegians make this mistake, even though their English is very good. When they put that in there, they will forget that they, plural, decide.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll be like, they, knowing that they were going to do it, decides.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? I think even native speakers would do that in English if the pronoun is separated from the verb by a big clause or something in between there, and you forget, how to conjugate it because it's been 10 minutes since you mentioned the pronoun.
Exactly. And if it's something that makes it sound plural, like you'll hear people say like, each one of us want to do that. And it's like, oh, actually each one of us wants to do that because one of us.
There's what would I say? I would say the group of people are on the beach. I think it's probably, I'm sure both are correct. The group of people is on the beach. And if you're thinking people plural, the group of people are on the beach. And so both of those sound almost equally correct to me, although I'm sure that grammar would officially say, I think that is correct because it's a group is on the beach.
I think it would depend. I mean, I agree with you that correctly it would be the group of people is on the beach, but I think it would really depend on exactly what you want to say. So if you want to emphasize that it's people are on the beach, and I just happened to kind of mention that it was a group at the beginning, it doesn't really sound wrong to say, that group of people, they're on the beach. Like,
well, and it's probably so commonly incorrect, or so frequent that people aren't even going to pick you up on it. And so even if you make a mistake, no one's going to be the one to be like, actually, it is.
Yeah. But I mean, probably the most common one you hear, it would have to be up there with the most common, with like, none of them were home.
Mm-hmm.
It's like that's even tough to explain to native speakers that none is like not one, so
Yeah.
not one was home. But yeah.
Well, it's
Anyway,
interesting
so
linguistically, right? Because it sort of gives you a door into the mind of what's below the language and the way in which the person's thinking and conceptualizing the things they want to then describe.
yes,
And so they have this thing, not a single person is individual, it's singular, but you're thinking of there were no people at home in a plural
exactly.
form, and so you
Yeah,
conjugate it that way. It's really interesting, right?
yeah, yeah.
So
Um,
how did you find it when you sort of stumbled on Swedish? What was the process, if you can describe it,
mm.
between sort of deciding to learn a language, what motivated you to do that, but then to pick Swedish and then to decide to carry it on seriously?
So it was Swedish before it was a language, as in I decided I wanted to learn Swedish, not necessarily a language.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was actually this is the bit that just sounds even more bizarre than just saying I'm learning Swedish. It was actually a Finnish woman who does not speak Swedish, or not well. So she's a Finnish native speaker. There are people in Finland who speak Swedish as a native language, but certainly not the majority.
Well, Swedes were colonists, right? There's some in Estonia, I think there's some in Russia, and there's some in Finland,
Yeah,
crazily
I
enough.
mean, yeah, and I mean that's also how. So you were chatting with Kate Burridge about how English got a Norse influence, and they kind of mixed up. And I believe, I'm not totally sure about this, but that's certainly the way that why Scots say a lot of their words the way they do. It makes a lot more sense when you start learning a Norse language.
Well, I think there's a dialect, right? Isn't there a dialect called Scots?
Yes.
I'm probably getting that wrong, but
Yeah.
that where they use a lot more Scandinavian words because of the Norse influence from, I imagine, the people from Iceland or the Danes that
Yeah.
came across and sort of settled in the top of Great Britain back in the day. But
Yeah.
when you hear that spoken, you just like, it's almost like I can understand 50-60% of it, but then it just drops out when they use certain words, and you're like,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. So anyway, what was I saying? So
The Finnish woman, yeah.
yeah, Finnish woman. So it was kind of random. Like I won't go into who she was, but she was almost a random to us, who ended up staying with us for a couple of days, my wife and I. And then she went to New Zealand for a couple of months, and then she came back and stayed for a couple more days, and we got to know her quite well, and we got to become quite good friends with her for how short a time it had been. And then she sort of casually invited us to Finland when she was about to go home.
And you were just like, done.
Yeah, well, pretty much. Like it was like, because I have not been to Europe since Germany back when I was at school.
See, to pause you there, it's so funny.
Yeah.
I went to France it would have been either year 10 or 11, because I was
Yeah.
studying French at school. And again, it was for about a month. And that was the last time I've been to Europe as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of like, I don't know if it was that, or I've had this idea ever since that I'd like to go back, but I didn't really have, in a way I was kind of like, oh, I don't want it to be Germany, because that's just a reminder of how much time I wasted at school not learning German.
Yeah.
And so I sort of like went, yeah, let's go to Finland, and you wouldn't just go to Finland, so let's go to Denmark and Sweden as well. And I kind of had this vague trip planned where we would go to Denmark and then up to Sweden and then across to Finland. Even though I don't think I even knew enough geography at the time to know whether that was possible and how you would do it. But I must have done some kind of research, because I eventually settled on that if I'm going to go to those. Sorry, just the plane passing over. I don't know how loud it is.
No, I can barely hear it. You're good.
Okay. Yeah, so I decided at some point that if I was going to go to those places, that I should learn one of the languages. Like, obviously, it wasn't realistic to learn 3 languages. Certainly not when one of them's Finnish.
Yeah,
Um,
for context, guys, I mean, most European languages are Indo-European, so they're all from the same family, but you have the Uralic languages as well, which is Estonian, Finnish, and Hungarian, which are completely different.
yeah,
They're probably about as different as, what's the other one there in Spain and France? Basque.
yeah,
That's also spoken, that's just a completely different family. And so these
yeah,
are like ancient languages.
yeah, and very like almost kind of like Finnish is not considered to be harder than say Mandarin or Japanese for an English speaker, but in a way you get the worst of both worlds because you get a completely foreign set of vocabulary, but also you get European annoying things like genders and
Yeah.
cases.
Yeah, the
Um,
case thing, I think they have I had a lot of friends who were Estonian, and I think they were
yeah,
saying they had like 12 cases. So instead of saying things like in and on and at and under and over, it's put at the end of a word and it's
yeah,
inflected, and it's just like, my God. So
yeah,
yeah, there's all these things that simplify it. They don't have he and she, and so they would often screw that up when talking to me. They'd be like, "Oh, he was over here yesterday." I'm like,
yeah,
"I was a woman. What are you talking
yeah,
about? Did I
yeah,
get that wrong?"
yeah,
But
yeah,
yeah, and then they would have cases, and you're just like, oh my God, this seems like a nightmare. But yeah,
yeah.
Finnish would be very, very, very difficult.
Yeah, and I think I roughly looked that up. Like I don't remember knowing that at the time, but I think I just kind of went, nah, a population of 5 million. Swedish has a population of 10 million, and from what I read, you could be understood in Norway as well,
And then
and Denmark. Yeah, well, at least I had the impression you could be understood in Denmark. I know now, as a keen student of Swedish, that even Swedes and Danes have trouble understanding each other. So then me understanding Danish is a whole new level again. But it definitely huge similarities. So it's
did you learn that dessert from Denmark? The jam dessert that's like oil, foil, oil.
oh no, I know what you're talking about now, but no, I didn't.
Every time I've met a Dane, they're like, "Can you say this?"
Yeah,
Like, no chance.
yeah,
But yeah, it is crazy though, right? Because that tends to be a reputation that I don't know if it's the Norwegians or if it's the Danes that can understand generally the other two pretty well, and then
Norwegians. Yeah,
it's the Norwegians, is it? And
yeah,
then you go to somewhere like Sweden and they can understand the Norwegians but not the Danes, and it's all
yeah,
about exposure though, I think, right? So the Norwegians are watching a lot more Danish content as well as Swedish because the
yeah,
Swedes are the biggest Scandinavian country there.
yeah.
And
It's a bit of both. So it's a bit of exposure. It's also to do with Norwegian does kind of sit in the middle of the two languages, even just like, what would you call it? Vocabulary wise or pronunciation wise, somewhat. So it's just a little bit closer for both of them, as in for Norwegian, from Norway to Sweden and Norway to Denmark, or those languages to each other. It's just not quite as big a kind of jump. Um, and and yeah, and exposure. But the other thing I've heard is that because um, Norwegians have to practice understanding each other because they've got, I'm going to say, more dialects
is
basically
it is
than.
it Bookmol? And
Mm,
there's another dialect. There's two primary ones, right?
well, the and then within those even they're
Yeah.
quite different. So it's almost like, if you're from Trollhättan or something, you can that a person from a couple of suburbs away is from like that place just by their accent and their
So
dialect.
it's sort of like Great Britain, right?
Yeah, and it's like, you can go full macro and just say, oh well, generally they sound like this, or you can go full micro down to like this guy lives like 5 streets away, and you can tell that from the way he speaks, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so they're just better versed in understanding things that are slightly different to their own, to exactly what they speak. So and so they even like I've even met Norwegians who said they didn't understand Swedish particularly well until they learned English, and then it didn't train their brain for understanding Swedish, but it trained their brain for understanding other things that were different to what they'd already learned to understand.
So it taught them that process of sort
Yeah,
of being open to understanding new things and trying to interpret things and everything.
yeah, yeah.
Far out. So you learned, or you decided to learn Swedish,
Yeah.
being someone who has obviously only been to Germany and hasn't ever been to Sweden. And I imagine being in Sydney, you probably didn't know too many Swedes personally. How did you go about learning the language from the beginning?
So I started with Duolingo, which is
Represent.
yeah, well,
Old school.
yeah. The thing is, I've developed this reputation now as like someone who regularly rags on Duolingo. Um, Although also YouTube has decided to plug one of my really old videos in which I talk about how good Duolingo is. So
Yeah.
it's like people, depending on what videos they've watched of me, have very different perceptions of how much I like Duolingo. I started with that, and then I think I just read Benny Lewis's book, like Fluent
Yeah.
in 3 months, where he mentioned italki. And once I knew about italki, I was just like, that's pretty much all I did. Like, as in, I I went and well, I found partners on italki. I wasn't prepared to fork out any money, so um, um, and well, that was really early, actually. I'd been using Duolingo for 6 weeks at that point when I tried to have my first
Damn.
conversation on italki. And so it was extremely stilted and just me sort of saying a lot of like, sorry, I didn't understand and that kind of thing. And so in the first year, I got very fluent in saying,
Can you repeat
like,
that?
yeah, like, very fluent at saying like, well, just simple things like this
But
or the
it's so
same.
funny
Yeah,
how much that's one of the biggest parts, and that's what I found with speaking Portuguese at home with my wife. The
yeah,
most common phrases I use tend to be related to me stumbling through the language. You know,
yeah,
like when I'm like, how do I say this? What does that mean? What did you say again? Or
yeah,
how can I describe this? How do you say this in Portuguese? How do you say this in English? But it's like they were some of the first phrases that I ever learned, and they're still, after 2 or 3 years, some of the most common phrases that I use today. So it is so important to go through that process and
yeah,
develop fluency around the phrases you're going to need in order to learn the language furthermore, you know,
yeah.
in that language. So
Yes, exactly. Yeah, without needing to go back to English and say, "Oh, sorry, can you just like
exactly.
how do you say this?" Like it's easy. It's not easier. It's better long term to say, "How do you say this in the language that you're trying to learn?"
And you feel good, right? Because then you can, someone can be listening to you on the outside and you're
Yeah.
actually just saying, sorry, man, I understand nothing you're saying. Could you repeat that again? Because I missed it. What word was that? And the person on the outside's like, man, this guy's fluent as shit. Like,
Exactly. Exactly.
at
Yeah.
least you're
Oh, if
containing it in a single language, right?
yeah. Yeah, even 2 years ago, if an Australian were to listen to me speaking Swedish, they thought I was fluent in Swedish. Even Swedes told me I was fluent in that, like I would be saying things like I'm not fluent and like my Swedish is quite bad. And I remember like someone in a group of Swedes saying like, no, I think you're like basically fluent. And I was like, no, I don't think so. But even just like that kind of won the argument for them because I was like, no, I don't think so, without pausing at all. Do you
Well,
get
you
what
could
I
have a
mean? Like,
fluent conversation, yeah, where they're
yeah.
just like, hey, how's it going? And you're like, sorry, I don't understand you. Could you repeat it again? And then they say it again. And you're like, well, we're having a fluent convo.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So
Yeah.
what was that process like? I remember seeing that video where you said you listened to or read Benny Lewis's book, Fluent
Yeah.
in 3 months, and it'll, as a side note, it'll be good to get your opinion on that now.
Yeah.
You know, the speak from day one, and within 3 months, you know, you should be quote unquote basically fluent. But
Yeah.
then when you dove in and you were doing all of these classes instead of going to class yourself and learning in a traditional environment or using things like Asimil or Pimsleur like you've got in the background,
Yeah.
how did you find the process of just getting one-on-one lessons and speaking from the start like that?
I think I actually got fairly addicted to that process in a way that wasn't particularly helpful for my language because I got, at first it's really, really uncomfortable, but it didn't take me too long, at least, or it didn't take me longer than I was comfortable with spending to come to a stage where you have that thing, like you just said, where you feel good and you actually get addicted to that feeling of like, yeah, I'm kind of fluent in this language because it happens quite quickly. Like let's say it does take 3 months. You you might not actually get that good in 3 months, but you get better than you think you can get.
Well, and
So
it's sort of diminishing returns, right? The first 3 months, you're probably going to learn more than you ever will for the rest of the time you're studying that thing. And it probably feels amazing to go from
yeah,
day 1 to day 90.
exactly. And then so I think particularly when I discovered, uh, I did have a few Swedish friends with whom I would chat on italki as regularly as I could, and then part of that was also in English as like an exchange for them. Um, and I think I was just addicted to the whole thing. In a way, I was actually just kind of making friends, and I was more addicted to that
Yeah.
than I was to really learning Swedish. And I remember actually that sometimes it got difficult in that I became quite good friends with them. So I'd actually feel like, yeah, I really want to talk about this thing with you, but it's like
Yeah.
way too complicated for my Swedish. So, and we'd sometimes just spend the whole like hour or whatever just speaking English because we'd just become mates almost.
I thought you were just going to say, you start the lesson and you're like, so what do you think of physics?
Oh yeah. No, well they would never do that to me, but
Yeah.
yeah, and then so after a while I started booking with teachers, and then even that was quite addictive, and then it was like, again, that was sort of a bit of a level up in that just having someone there who was like teaching me and who would come to the lesson with some material and be like, let's read this through. And like, even though I was really bad at it, because this is after like a year and my Swedish was still bad. Like it was good for a year, I suppose, but it was terrible, really.
Yeah.
Even just that feeling of like someone there kind of almost spoon feeding me Swedish. I think I just liked that. So I just kept doing that. And I was under the impression that if I just kept speaking Swedish with a teacher, I would eventually become completely fluent, which is like kind of true in that I am completely fluent in a lot of things. But
It's funny how you realize that pretty quickly, right? When
yeah,
there's this kind of, it seems like this objective that's impossible from the beginning, which is fluency.
yeah,
And then all of a sudden you find yourself there and you realize, shit, it's just fluent in this one little area. And there's actually
yeah,
like thousands of other areas that I haven't even jumped into yet. And the next level above that's like a meta thing, right? Where the level above that is actually having the fluency to switch in and out of all these different areas and be able to, go through all of this landscape of language about, the beach or about your work or about your family. And you have to kind of join them together. And so it's kind of like a choose your own adventure, and it just keeps fractaling out and
yeah,
becoming more and more full on. And you're like, as much as you feel good at times, right, about
yeah,
like, yeah, I can have these great conversations, you're also like, fuck, I know so much about how little I know.
yeah, exactly. And you like it was a weird feeling and quite a degrading feeling. That's not the right word.
Demotivating, like,
Demotivating feeling of like, um, I felt like I was fluent in Swedish. So there's this point where your ego tells you like, this is a language you speak now.
yeah.
And then you go and try and watch something without subtitles, and you're like, I have no idea what they're saying. Like
Get
not
a cold dose of reality.
yeah, like not even a little bit. Like I can tell they say hello, and then like what the heck goes on after that? Like,
Yeah.
and that just like with what I've kind of learned about language learning, which I've probably learned more about that than I have about Swedish almost.
Well,
In
that's
this,
to
yeah,
sort of pause you there. That's
yeah,
so funny. I was chatting to someone recently saying, Pete, I saw that you speak Portuguese with your wife. I'm married to a Brazilian. How do I learn Portuguese?
yeah,
And I was like, oh my God, like,
yeah,
where do we begin, dude?
yeah,
But the conversation ended up getting to that point where you're just like, ultimately, you're not learning Portuguese. You're learning how to learn a foreign language as an adult. Go,
yeah,
go and
yeah,
do it. You can do it however you want. I don't have the right answer. You kind of have to work out how it works best for you. And that's the sort of easiest / most complicated answer you could ever get.
yeah,
But you kind of have to go and work out, how do I learn a language? How can I implement that? How can I be productive? How can I clean up my own life and everything like that and make this work? Do it
yeah,
for a long period of time. And also have it sort of check that you're like, I'm not expecting to just speak from day one for 3 months, and bam, native level fluency.
Yeah,
Next language.
exactly. Yeah. So I forget what I was going to say, but like looking at that, well, I guess I now know that, like, of course I couldn't understand native speaker material and movies and stuff because I never tried to understand them. It's not a matter of, like, I could probably be as fluent as anything when, not that I was, but if I had have been very, very fluent in speaking Swedish and still not have understood those things because I'm not used to understanding them. Like, I didn't, unlike English, I didn't grow up watching stuff in Swedish. Like,
I
it
was watching
sounds so
something.
obvious, but
I was watching something today with my son,
yeah,
who's about 15 months old now. We're
yeah,
watching this TV show that's in English, and I didn't realize, I think it was Peppa Pig or something.
mm,
All the characters have different accents from all over the world. So
yeah,
there's a Scottish one, there's an American one, there's another one from Great Britain, and you're like, holy crap, they're getting exposure to all those vast languages from effectively day one. I mean, languages, accents from
yes,
effectively day one. I'm like,
yeah,
I'm so astonished that they're already, and I think they would have strategically decided, let's use multiple accents in these kids' videos to just prepare them.
yeah,
So it is funny though. You were saying you've been learning Swedish, but you're practicing sort of the same thing, right? You're getting
yeah,
very good at having fluent conversations through italki with Swedes, sort of on your own terms, but you weren't
yeah,
necessarily able to just flick on the TV and watch whatever Swedish film or TV show came up. That seems to be something a lot of my listeners have issues with, especially with Australian English, because
yeah,
one, I think they don't get exposure to it. There's less content out there for them too,
yeah,
and they end up coming over here all of a sudden when they've learnt British or American English their whole life.
yeah,
So taking sort of on board what you've experienced and then obviously diving a bit further in and understanding the nuances of more specific Swedish dialectual stuff,
yeah.
what advice would you have for people who were in a similar position to you that are trying to now learn this other, dialect or slang or, more specific stuff?
Well, I guess the first piece would be that if you're going to move to Australia or if you have moved to Australia, then maybe take this attitude, even though this doesn't matter in the long term, but like for now, take an attitude that you're trying to learn Australian, you're not trying to learn English. Because if you have the attitude that you're trying to learn English, then you'll count any content you get in English as being like part of like your practice. So you'll be like, oh, I watched an American movie, so that kind of counts. But like, well, if you could already understand that, then that doesn't really do anything for your practice. Or even if it was difficult to understand, it really only helped you understand that movie.
Well, you've gone to the gym and it's like it's deadlift day and you're like, but I'm good at push-ups. I'm just going to keep
Yeah,
doing push-ups and hope my deadlifts get better in their own terms.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. So I would take an approach that you're trying to learn Australian English, and there's not it's not really going to matter if you only end up learning Australian English because that's not really possible. Like,
Yeah.
firstly, you probably already learnt quite a lot of British and American English, but secondly, if you really do get that good at Australian English, then it's really just a couple of things you need to learn about American and British English before you'll be able to understand them as well.
Well, and the
Um,
majority of the stuff you'll learn in Australian English, apart from the odd slang word and obviously acclimating to the accent and,
yeah,
and stuff, is applicable in all other areas of English. I can communicate with Americans and British people, like
yeah,
it's not a waste of your time, and it's almost like you're being efficient, you're doubling up because you're getting this top layer of accent exposure, slang exposure, but you're also reinforcing the English that you've already learnt by using Australian materials as opposed to using British or American materials, right?
yeah. And the other thing is, if it makes a lot of sense if you see it from the other way around. So most people will acknowledge that it's not a good idea to try and learn two languages at once, or three languages at once, or five or six, especially if you start them both from scratch. So if you start learn,
Simultaneously.
yeah, if you start trying to learn French and Dutch on the same day,
Or
then
Swedish.
yeah, or anything. Yeah. Well, I didn't start them on the same day, to be fair. I did study Swedish first, but
I'm being cheeky there because I wanted to
yeah,
prompt you to kind of talk about your experience doing that, but keep
yeah.
going, keep going.
Yeah, so if you see it as that, like, okay, it's a really bad idea to try and learn 2 or 3 languages at the same time, then it's actually in the same way a really good idea to only try and learn one part of one language at a time. Like, how easy would it be for me to tell you 5 ways that you can say how are you in Swedish right now? It would actually be pretty easy. Like, I'm sure you would have the confidence to say, yeah, I could learn that in the next half an hour or whatever. Whereas if I tried to say, I'm going to tell you all the greetings and all the ways to say how are you and all the ways to respond to that in the next half an hour, then you'd be like, well, I'm never going to remember that. So instead of trying to learn English, which is this huge, I put that in quotes for people listening, this massive thing spoken by a huge number of people across the whole globe, just trying to learn Australian English is kind of maybe 2/3 the size of that job, which is already more manageable. And then even focusing down even more, it gets a little bit tricky when you try and focus on, because you can't help what people say. So you can't, if someone says something you don't understand, you're going to be like, sorry, what did you just say? And then by definition, you're trying to learn that thing. So it's sort of not up to you exactly what you're going to learn, but it's at least up to you to say, I'm not going to learn British English or American English. That is your choice.
Well, and I think you have to work out what's going to help you the most, right? It's kind of like Pareto principle stuff where you need to spend 80% of your time focusing on the 20% that's going to have the biggest effect in your life. And so if you're living in Australia currently and you're trying to get a job here, you're trying to, you've got a partner here who's Australian as well, or you've got a lot of friends who are Australian, it's not going to really help you that much to learn watch Game of Thrones and have to wrap your head around all these British accents. When ultimately, whenever you leave your house, you're having to use Australian English and understand the slang and everything. And so you have to work out where's the lowest hanging fruit, what's the easiest stuff that I can focus on and get the most out of. And then your life gets easier, right? It actually gets simpler.
Yeah. But then also not being afraid to like climb the tree, so to speak, once you get the low hanging fruit, because it's like, I know this Venezuelan girl who her English doesn't seem to have improved in the last quite a number of years, and I think it's just because she can kind of say all the things she needs to say, even though sometimes we have difficulty understanding her, and I'm sure she doesn't understand everything we're saying, but I think it's just because she's like, oh well, I've gotten to this point now, so it's it's not improving for her because she's only doing the same things.
Well, it's the intermediate plateau, right? Which is an interesting concept because a lot of people think it's like, oh, this is where stuff gets hard in terms of learning the language and pushing through. But I think a lot of the time it's actually the inverse, where things have gotten too easy that now you don't have to push as hard. And so you don't as a result. Like your comfort zone has effectively covered the majority of whatever it is that you have to worry about, your work, relationships, everything in English. And it's just easier to not have to go outside your comfort zone very often, because I found that with Portuguese. I dove in when we were living in Canberra about 2.5 years ago, and we moved into a house with 4 other Brazilians, and I just said, fuck English. I'm just speaking in Portuguese for as long as possible now, because I know that it's going to pay off. I want kids that grow up speaking Portuguese. And it was hard at first, but then it became much easier because you do go over the same phrases day in, day out, day in, day out. But then for probably after I made that video about not speaking English for 12 months, in brackets at home, it hasn't improved that much since then. My fluency has probably improved in terms of, and my listening, like my wife speaks to me and it's just bang, I understand and I reply. But we're always talking about the same things. I'm not suddenly going, hey, can we talk about the Hadron Collider in Switzerland and how physics, so we have to go out of our way now to try and find more difficult topics. So I was thinking, when I was thinking about the intermediate plateau, it's kind of like things didn't get harder, but it's more of a habit kind of thing. It's more of a behavioral thing it's become harder to find a challenge and
Yeah.
then to accept it, right? So
Yes.
did you face that with Swedish?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say I only really even acknowledged that that challenge was there in April of this year, 2020, when I officially kind of went, nah, fuck French. I'm not studying French anymore, because I just like, my Swedish and my French are actually better than I made out in a video that where I said I'm not studying French anymore.
Yeah.
But uh, I didn't. I just felt like I wasn't very comfortable in either of them, and I really only acknowledged that I'm only going to get very comfortable in Swedish and really sound, even to Swedes, like I've been speaking it for a very long time, if I only do that. And so that was really the first time I'd actually acknowledged that that this intermediate plateau was like a real thing almost.
And that the fact you were trying to maintain or learn both those languages had sort of slowed you down and kept you at that stage for longer than you would desire in
Exactly.
either language, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So it was like, well, I guess I knew the fact that, like, okay, the intermediate plateau is long, or like, sorry about the dog, by the way, if you
Don't
can
be
hear
silly,
that.
all good, man. It adds ambience, a bit of atmosphere.
Bit of Australian atmosphere. Yeah, so I guess I knew the fact that it was long, and the fact that to really get my Swedish to an advanced level, I would need to do it a lot, but I still was not prepared to acknowledge that doing it a lot would mean not really doing anything else other, like, it's certainly not dividing my free time between French and Swedish.
You just have to go whole hog, right?
Yeah, because it's like, if you could definitely do that, if you could do two languages if that's the only thing you had to do with your life, but most people are not in that position. So I was like, well, if I only have this much time to dedicate to languages, then it should be to one language. But so that's absolutely the a challenge I've faced with it, in that I was just getting 1% more comfortable with every conversation at saying basically the same things or some variation of the same things. I'd probably been doing that for like a year.
Yep.
And then, like, again, back to the thing of watching stuff without subtitles. It's really only been since then, and since I started watching a lot of stuff without subtitles, that I felt like I can do that. Like,
Yep.
I now regularly I regularly watch Swedish stuff without subtitles, and I only use the subtitles for, like, study, as in if I didn't hear something, I'm like, wait, and I go back and I actually turn the Swedish subtitles on, and then I go and look up that word or whatever. And the same with reading. Like, I can read in Swedish comfortably now, but back then it was less comfortable. But it's also just, I'm now sort of going out of my way to go, okay, this word, what is this word? I've never seen it before. And so it was really just a question of acknowledging that my comfort zone was not that big. Like, going like, actually, there's a lot of stuff that lies outside of my comfort zone that I've never even acknowledged, because I'm just like, no, I'm not.
And
I don't want to.
Once you embrace it, it just becomes easier to get to, right? You can go one of two ways. You can either just say, okay, I can't handle facing my ego and saying that I'm not as good as I would like to be, and so I'll just sit at this level forever because I can get by.
Yeah.
And the other one is you just say, I'm going to be thirsty for improvement until I die, and the results will speak for themselves.
Absolutely. Yeah. And
so have you seen the results since you've done that? Have you noticed a big shift from when you were studying both languages and dividing your time? Big improvement, I should say.
It's like, I don't want to, it's a cliche, but yes and no. So yes, I definitely have, like, even I myself feel more fluent, and it's not just, I'm actually probably equally fluent, but I feel like sometimes I just say stuff that's like was definitely out of my comfort zone back in March or something.
Yeah.
And I'll say it without even realizing that I was on my way to saying it. Like,
Yeah.
I'll just say it, and at the end of it, I'll go like, whoa, did I just say that? And it was all correct as well. And also a lot of my teachers, I really only started booking regular Swedish lessons again back in March, because I had been focusing on French for basically the first 3 months of this year. So so that it was like a couple of weeks while my teachers got to know me anyway. And they were like, okay, you've been studying a few years. Yeah, no worries. But then because I was focusing quite heavily on it and going out of my way to go like, okay, what's this thing that I don't understand? What's going on? I was more actively studying it. In the next couple of weeks, the teachers were like, wow, like you've gotten a lot better. It's not the biggest improvement I've ever seen in a student, but it's the biggest improvement I've ever seen in one who's been studying for that long.
Wow.
Like,
that must have felt good.
Yeah, I mean, one of them just said you've gotten a lot better, but one of them was like you've gotten sort of about, I would expect it normally to take like from the third year to the fourth year to get how much better you've just gotten in like the last 2 months kind of thing.
Well, I think that goes, there's a book that, where is it here? By How to Improve Your Foreign Language Immediately by Boris Schechtman, who was a guy who helped I think, is it the Foreign Institute of Languages or whatever it is with Russian.
Yeah.
And he's written this book with just effectively 6 techniques that can immediately improve your fluency in a language. And it's not because you suddenly learn a whole bunch more in the language. It's more you learn how to implement sort of a bunch of techniques to use what you already know. And so a big thing I found with a lot of my students too is a lot of the time they know a shitload and they just don't realize how to sort of put it into practice. And so a big part of it is kind of understanding what kind of practices you need to put into place and in order to let your English or whatever language it is that you're learning show itself fully. And so you can, have these sudden moments then where you like have this huge perceivable improvement, but it's been there underlying the whole thing the whole time, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's like, so the no part is that like I don't want to give people the impression that if they just kind of step up their focus for like a week that they'll suddenly see a big improvement in fluency. Like what this is going back to before when I said yes and no. I don't want to give people the impression that you just need to just focus on English for an extra hour every day this week and you'll see an improvement in fluency. Like that's not how it works, and certainly not if you're at the level that can already listen to this podcast without too much difficulty.
Yeah.
You will, if you notice a big change, it will be more likely that it's like big in comparison to like maybe the last year of progress in which you didn't feel like you made any at all. And then if you can find a technique for you that can improve your English. But then in going on to sort of my other improvements, I've basically in the last couple of months taught myself to understand native speaker content, which again, like as you were just saying, it's not that none of the vocab was there or anything, because I didn't learn Swedish in the last couple of months, but I trained my brain to understand all the words that it already had in there, I guess, and learned a couple of other little things that are really handy to know, that won't come up in your Duolingo course or anywhere else, but I used a lot. So in that way, my Swedish is at a very different stage to the one it was at 4 months ago. Must be 4 months ago. In that now my default is Swedish content, no subtitles.
Yeah.
And that was not the case at all in March. Like if I watched something in Swedish with no subtitles, I wouldn't be able to tell you whether it was a really good show or a bad show. I'd just be like, it looked good.
It was in Swedish.
Yeah. It may not have made sense. I don't know. But now I don't know if you've heard of the show Caliphate, the Netflix series.
Yeah. I think I have. Is that I think I've seen it. I don't think I've watched it.
Yeah. So it's like it's not complicated, but it's sort of complicated. It's like terrorism and Syria and Sweden and like I watched the whole thing without subtitles and could give you a full rundown of it if I wanted. And that's just, I'm not saying that to brag, but like compared to February when I was like,
Well, and that's the point, right? It goes to
Yeah.
show that when you implement these sorts of changes and focus on having a strategy and studying smart, not necessarily hard,
Yeah.
you can make those big gains despite having obviously already spent a few years studying and thinking you weren't going to improve because you were in the intermediate plateau. So
Yeah.
what advice would you have for people in a similar position to you where they're living abroad? Well, they're living abroad relative to me. They're living in their home countries, learning English, learning Australian English. I would imagine with your Swedish, you could probably get off a plane tomorrow in Sweden, somewhere that I should add that you've never actually been,
Yeah.
and get along just fine. What advice would you have for people learning English in, say, Brazil or China, who've never been to Australia, Britain, or America, but want to have that kind of level of English? What should they do whilst they're at home in their own country?
Mm-hmm. It's very hard to give specific advice because I know that everyone's a little bit different. So I would say that one thing that has contributed to my language learning the most that everyone can do is to increase your patience / your level, your what is sometimes called your tolerance for discomfort. So I better credit that. That comes from Matt Bonder, aka Matt versus Japan. He talks about increasing your tolerance for discomfort, and this can be in anything. So like cold showers will do it. Like if you regularly take cold showers, or if you were regularly taking hot showers and you switch to cold, you'll find that like your willingness to just do things that you don't necessarily like doing increases. So
Well, to pause you there, that was something that I used to be very fit, and then I became relatively fat and soft. And then I started getting fit again, and I'd forgotten just how much getting into a gym and starting to work out and doing something that's uncomfortable and that's difficult trains you to look for discomfort, because you suddenly have this positive feedback loop of, if it's uncomfortable, it's doing me good because it's going to increase my fitness, it's going to increase my muscle mass, it's going to make me stronger.
Yeah.
And so you start actually enjoying the process of searching for discomfort, and it leads to a positive feedback loop that ends up, shooting you along. And so if you can cultivate that in a language learning thing, that's definitely, a really, really powerful tool to have in the tool belt, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty soft when it comes to gyms. I like running, and
it must be exactly the same thing though, there, right? Once it gets too easy, running at a certain pace or at a certain distance, you just like, fuck this, let's up it, bitch. Like, let's take this to the next level.
Yeah, but just like languages, you can get to a stage where you will just like run every afternoon, and you'll just run at 6-minute Ks. And that it never gets any faster because you never go any faster. Like,
well, you need a purpose, right? You need a goal. You need to be like, why am I running? Am I running to increase my fitness, or am I just trying to sort of tread water and stay where I've always been? And that's what, with language learners, right? They need to be like, am I trying to get to a better level, or am I trying to maintain what I already have?
Yeah. And I think it's important to understand that the same thing will happen with language learning. Like, you will doing the same thing over and over again, no matter how much you do it, just won't improve after a certain point. Sorry, you won't improve as a result of it after a certain point. The same with running. If you ran a 6-minute K every afternoon, it wouldn't matter if you did that from the age of 15 to 50, you would never get any faster.
You're not going to suddenly pull out a 4-minute K.
No. But I think we think that because of our experience, or what we think our experience was as children, we think that if you just speak it for long enough, you'll eventually become like a native speaker. But children are constantly out of their comfort zone, so they don't even acknowledge it as a thing. Like they don't even, they're so used to just being challenged on, like, they'll say,
they have no comfort zone, right?
Yeah. So
there's nothing that they're good at.
And even like in high school, they should be pushed outside of their comfort zone. So like I'm a big advocate for like roughly trying to replicate the experience of a high school student if you're kind of okay at your language. Like I'm probably not in terms of spoken fluency, I would still be less than that, but in terms of my understanding of Swedish as a whole, I'm probably similar to like a 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old, somewhere around there. So to get to a full adult native speaker, I will need to go through high school as it, or something that replicates high school. So like reading books and discussing that with someone, like, okay, what are the
Writing
ideas being
essays.
expressed? Yeah,
Yeah. Thinking
exactly.
about it. And I think too that it's sort of a double-edged blade, right? When you're an adult, one, you've got a lot of competence in a lot of areas, and so you don't like the feeling of being new at anything because it's like that's so foreign. I have my job, I have my skills, this is what I'm good at, this is how I get respect, this is why people like me, it's a big
Yeah,
ego thing. And so I don't want to be the person at the bottom of the pyramid being like, I don't know anything. So you have to kind of overcome that.
yeah.
And there was a second point that I was going to make that I've forgotten, but yeah.
Well, I completely agree with you, even without knowing what your second point was. I feel like you might have been going to say something like, um, just then, but you don't like doing that, so you don't. But then also, I guess maybe as an adult, you have less time to do it anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, I honestly, and I'm actually going to make a video about this when I've kind of formed my thoughts on it. But I think that we're all a little bit addicted to basically understanding everything all the time,
Yeah.
and being able to express ourselves mostly exactly how we would want to. And learning a language increases even your awareness for how you can't always express yourself exactly the way you would want to, even in English. Like sometimes I've now realized that sometimes I try to say things that I'm like, it's not exactly what I want to say. Like the best way I know to say it is this, but it's not quite right.
It's like
And
holding a mirror up here, right? When you're starting to
yeah,
learn a new language, you're like, here are all of my flaws.
yeah. Um, and so I think it's really good for your, I mean, this is not what you asked me before. This is not advice for, if people are listening to this from a country that isn't Australia, then they're already exposing themselves to English, which is good.
Yeah.
But I think learning a language is good on a meta level, just for understanding even like your shortcomings in your own language, and just understanding like how your brain works as a like in terms of your motivation and things like that.
On how to learn, right? Because then
Yeah,
you can just apply it. I think we were talking previously, and you were saying, like me, you're sort of frustrated with yourself at times because your attention and interest changes pretty quickly from one subject to another. And so I've
yeah,
switched. I've tried to learn multiple other languages. I've tried, jujitsu. I've been at the gym. I've done photography. There's all these things, but it's some of them they've maintained themselves. But at the same
yeah,
time, it is interesting to notice yourself going between them. But the good thing is that once you start getting good at learning a language, you've also become an expert. Like you've also become an expert in learning something at
yes,
an older age, and you can kind of take that and apply it elsewhere. So that if you wanted to pick up something like race car driving, even though it's something completely different from learning
yeah,
Swedish or English, you're going to be like,
yeah,
okay, so I need to do repetitions, I need to understand techniques, I need to spend time on task. And the more hours that I put in, the more I focus on these things, the better I'm going to get faster, as opposed to someone fresh off the boat, a young kid or whatever that's just like, I want to be a race car driver.
yeah,
I'll play Need for Speed, you
yeah.
know?
Well, and I think the one thing that separates languages from many other things, not from everything, but from many other fields that people get interested in, is that you have to be a little bit better at it before it's of really any use.
Yeah.
Like, especially if you say, not that I'm necessarily advocating for this, but if you learn a language like Swedish, where most people already know your language, if as a native English speaker,
Yeah.
you have, in order for that to be at all useful or even slightly impressive, it has to be pretty good. Whereas like photography, like, everyone these days is just like take some crappy old picture. And it's like if it's of a nice scene, like a sunset or whatever, it still looks pretty good. You don't actually have to know what you're doing for it to be okay.
Yeah.
So most people don't go out of their way to get really, really, really good. Whereas in a language, I think you kind of have to at least go a little bit out of your way to get okay at it, to even sound like you somewhat know what you're talking about.
Oh, and I think we're sort of in a different boat too, because we already speak English as our first language. And so unlike anyone or everyone who's listening to this, probably who doesn't have English as a native language, you guys are in a different position where this isn't a joke. It's not fun. It's not a hobby. This is, for the most part, for you guys listening, you're migrating to this country. You're trying to get a serious career going in this country or whatever country, but you need to do it in English. You need it for business. You need it for friends, family. Like, it's your motivations are in a completely different position, but you should also focus on them and use them as fuel to keep yourself pushing, right? To get out of that comfort zone, because the reward is a lot more. It's a lot higher than you or I, who are just like, I hope we can go to these countries and, make sure we don't get lost.
Yeah, exactly. Although I've got to say that I'm actually really glad that, not for the obvious reasons, I'm really glad that I've never had to learn a language for work, whether it's English or any other language, because I'm horrible at motivating myself with extrinsic factors. Like, if someone could say like, oh, if you just wash 30 cars tomorrow, you'll make $1 million, which would be like an amazing deal. But I would have to really push myself to wash those 30 cars. Like, whereas, most people would be like, oh, that's a great deal. I'm going to do that. Whereas I would be like, oh, do I really have to, can't I just wash like 10? Like,
and just get 100 grand.
Yeah, exactly. Like, so I would be, if I was, a Brazilian, then I would be the worst at English, because it'd be like one of those things like, and even sometimes
getting forced to do it. Learn that language.
Once you add external factors, I'm almost worse at
I feel you. That was me in maths in high school. Everyone was like, it's going to be so useful later on in life, which it is. At the same time, I was like, I still hate it. Anyway, man, I've kept you for over an hour. The last thing I wanted to ask you before we finish up is that you have 2 children. I believe one is 9 and one is a newborn. You're raising, at least from what I understand, the newborn with exposure to Swedish, which is not your native language. Can you tell me about that process? Because I'm sure there are a lot of listeners who have got children and they're worried about whether or not they should speak English to them because it's not their native language.
Yeah, well, my basic theory is that there's no way that my kid's not going to learn English. like it's not really possible here in Australia.
I challenge you to try and raise it without any exposure.
Yeah, so like that's not really a danger we face. Like the biggest danger is that when he gets to kindergarten or year 1, his vocabulary might not be quite as big as the average kindergarten or year 1s, but
in English,
yeah. But so my theory is that the worst that can happen is that he doesn't actually really speak Swedish or even understand Swedish when he gets to primary school, which wouldn't be any worse than what would happen anyway.
Exactly.
And my other kind of the best thing that can happen is that he will grow up with just more awareness of what different sounds are, and because Swedish is very similar to English in terms of vocabulary and grammar, but pretty different in terms of pronunciation. So even just an awareness of sounds that are foreign to an English speaker would be handy.
To pause you there, it's really funny. I go to my sister's place. She lives around the corner, and we take our son, and we're speaking Portuguese to him. And my niece, who's 2, is always like, Uncle Pete's English is really weird, and I don't understand it. And so her mum's like, no, he's not speaking English. There's actually other languages, other ways of communicating. And so it is good that they have that exposure of like, no, like there's different cultures, languages, there's people of different races, blah, blah, blah. And you get to have that conversation earlier, right? They have an awareness of it. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. And and the other good thing that can happen is that it just gets me in the habit of speaking Swedish. So it was really weird at first, because obviously when you say he's less than 3 months old, and when you say anything to a less than 3 month old, it doesn't matter what you say, they can't understand you anyway. So it was really weird at first to have like my wife next to me, and I'm speaking to someone who doesn't understand it no matter what I say, and I'm speaking a language she doesn't fully understand. Obviously, she can pick up some of the things I'm saying to him just from like, there's only a few things you would say to a baby, like, oh, you're so cute and whatever. But
I was telling him about Da Vinci.
But yeah, and it was really weird at first, but it's actually become extremely normal, to the point that even just in this short time, to the point that I'll be talking to my older son, and then I'll hear like the baby make a noise, and I'll turn around and say like, "Vad pratar du om?" Like, what are you talking about, kind of thing, like without my brain having to consciously shift.
Yeah.
Which is not like, maybe it's not actually improving my Swedish on a, grammatical or a level that can be tested, but it's definitely improving my brain's ability to switch between the two.
Well, and it's giving you use for it, right? So that if you were otherwise just absorbing it all day long, unless you were in a lesson, at least now you're using it and you're speaking it on a continual basis. And the good thing is you're probably going to start from basic stuff, but it's going to get more and more complicated as the child grows gradually.
Yeah. And so, exactly. And then like my brother kind of tried to do this with his kid with German, but my brother's German is not good. Like, he really doesn't speak. I wouldn't really call him a German speaker. But he sort of had this idea that he might try and raise his son in German, but I don't think he really speaks it enough. And the other thing is that he never gives his son exposure to German that isn't his own.
Yeah.
So even if that did work, his son would only understand like the basic things that my brother says. Whereas my plan with my son is to actually essentially raise him on a Swedish media diet.
Yeah.
So like, I've already got Charlie or Lola, Charlie and Lola in Swedish. And that stuff, that those things they watch as kids, is hugely impactful on their personality and everything.
Yeah, for sure.
So even if it's like the whole thing fails miserably, the worst thing that's happened is that I've watched some TV with him in Swedish, really.
You've done your reps. You've been lifting 1 kilo dumbbells for the last few years, and you're like,
exactly.
Well, it's been exercise. I've been burning calories. I've been, the engine's on.
Exactly. But really, I don't think I don't think it'll actually fail that spectacularly. Like, obviously I don't expect him to speak Swedish really fluently or anything, but to even just have some understanding of it, or to have, like you said, an understanding that there are other languages and that they sound completely different, and like I don't really see any downsides to it, apart from maybe a slight trade-off in his English.
Well, there are benefits. I was reading a book called The Bilingual Brain, and I think there are a few that they've shown, especially not necessarily because they speak 2 languages in and of themselves, that it's, going to make them smarter, but they get better at code switching, which can be effectively that they can manage multiple tasks better at a younger age, and, develop as a result of that, have better concentration because they're used to having to turn it on constantly.
Okay. Wow.
But anyway, Lamont, man, it's been a pleasure. I kept you longer than I should have. Where can people find out more about you and what you do?
At the moment, it's only on YouTube, at Days of French and Swedish. So if you just put Days of French and Swedish into YouTube, then and if you want more English practice, I'm going to shameless plug for my much smaller channel. But if you're into movies or TV series, I have a second channel that I enjoy putting stuff on, called the Reykjavik Review. So Reykjavik is the capital of Iceland, so Reykjavik Review. If you want practice in hearing how critics talk about movies and TV series and stuff.
Yeah, it's good. Jag är lite isländsku. I was learning Icelandic for a while. I loved it, but the use wore out pretty quickly. I was like,
Yes.
I am never going to meet an Icelander in Australia.
Yeah.
Anyway, Lamont, thank you so much. And we're about to record an interview on Lamont's channel. So go and check out his YouTube channel at Days of French and Swedish. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Pete.
See ya.